Book 2, Part 8, Chapter 9. Back in Polson, Track stood and rushed to the door as the howls announced Ryan's return. Phil stood, and Rock, Jackson, Marcus, and the other two wolves watched him carefully as Track unlocked the door and disappeared outside. He jogged through the house and out the front door, then waited as Ryan's car pulled in. He could sense his alpha's anger as soon as the car door opened. Track growled but stood quietly while Ryan and the other two wolves walked over. Seems things didn't go so well. Ryan's jaw was tight and he only shook his head as he walked past Track and into the house. They were at Ryan's place now, and had been since Phil destroyed a good portion of his own family's home the night Raina had snuck over to see him. It was being repaired, but Ryan had moved Phil here for everyone's sake. Track sat on a chair, slumped forward, as Ryan nearly ripped the phone off the wall and pushed the buttons. He wanted to know what had happened, but since it was obviously not good, he would wait. Phil and the others came out, Ryan's two staying close by the Click Alpha. They all sat in the large living room and waited quietly. Track turned his eyes towards Phil. He looked so different now. The Click Alpha had always been so alive, happy, and confident. Now, he looked like a man that had had half the life drained from him. He barely ate, barely slept, and looked like someone took him out back and beat him good. The bags under his eyes made him look old. His hair was a mess, and his eyes had nothing but pain in them. Ryan turned. "We wait until the others get here," he stated in a low voice, and then sat. The silence was unnerving, but no one questioned it. Ryan was the alpha, and they all knew things had not gone well. Finally, there was a knock on the door. Ryan nodded, and one of the wolves walked over, unlocked it, and let the others in. Track saw his father amongst the six that came in. David glanced at his son, his own face grave. The living room was set up for casual meetings, and it had plenty of seating for all of them. There were 4 long couches and half a dozen armchairs, with a stack of folding chairs tucked into one corner. When everyone was seated, Ryan stepped up and faced them all. As you have guessed, the talk at the manor did not go well, at all. He drew in a slow breath. There was no point sugarcoating this or drawing it out. Her father thinks we're making the whole thing up to keep her from unioning with a non-wolf. The room exploded in voices then. Track threw his hands up as he yelled, and the others joined in. Only Phil remained seated, looking quietly down at his hands that were interlocked in his lap. Ryan let them vent, his own anger being refueled by the emotions that swam through his packmates. He had told the vampire the truth, all of it. Thomas had laughed at first, and then went nearly mad when Ryan tried to explain the depth and seriousness of wolf bonding. He shook himself and looked up into the room. This pack was his. All of them looked to him and depended on him, and he had let them down. He had never expected the vampire to simply nod and turn over his only daughter. He also had no intention of trying to force the man to allow Phil to just take his daughter. But he had expected the vampire to listen with an open mind. He had hoped the vampire would want to give his daughter the chance to see where her heart really laid. If she still wanted the big city vampire, he would deal with setting Phil straight, no matter what it took. But if she felt that bond too, then she had a right to be able to be with him. Why he had thought that vampire would allow his daughter the right to choose was beyond him. He should have known better. He wanted her with a vampire and had manipulated her life to make sure it happened. Thomas Blvd was not as open-minded as he pretended to be. His jaw tightened and his fist clenched. When he had tried to explain the connection between two wolves, he had made the mistake of using the term mating. The conversation fell apart there. Outside of werewolves, the term seemed to invoke a totally different concept, and no matter how hard he tried to explain it, the vampire had locked on to his own conclusions. Then, out of an almost desperate attempt to explain the powerful bond between Phil and Raina, he made the fatal mistake of using the word magical. The talk ended there. Thomas accused Ryan of making the whole thing up to keep his daughter with the pack. Ryan had pushed away the insults and tried to reason with her father, but it was no use. Thomas Blvd actually believed that he was trying to take his daughter away from him. He ordered him out of the manor, off the grounds, and told him he would make sure his daughter was never infected by them again. Infected, Jackson hissed as Ryan retold his story to them. When Ryan nodded, Track punched the air. He knows we wouldn't do something like this just to keep her with the pack. To take up a plan like this, just to keep her away from a vampire, and just because he's a vampire, Jackson spat, the veins in his neck pulsing hard with his anger. I know, Ryan replied quietly. He had to let them get this first burst of anger out. After that, they would be able to think more clearly. Right now, they needed to vent, to rage, and to pour out all the emotions he himself had to keep restrained. Jackson and Rock nearly ripped the furniture apart as they plotted against the vampire house. Track pulled out his phone and punched buttons madly. Ryan didn't stop him. He knew that, before he even made it off the grounds, the vampire would have made sure they couldn't contact her. Ryan closed his eyes for a moment and thought about Raina. She was like a little sister to them all, even like a daughter to some. Her smiling, laughing face danced behind his eyes, and his heart ached. She was Pack. That didn't go away with the anger that they had towards her vampire father. She couldn't help her bloodline. Females were very precious to the Pack, and even now he felt the loss of her squeeze at his heart. A small smile crossed his lips as he remembered the time she had got stuck in the tree, trying to outclimb the boys. Her face would haunt him now. His throat tightened and the smile fell as the guilt grew. When he opened his eyes, he looked through the crowd that was still throwing out threats to the manor and its inhabitants. He looked at Phil, who felt a stare and glanced up. Ryan's heart squeezed tighter. It was hard looking into those eyes now. They were so filled with pain, so filled with an ache that he could only try to imagine. His once strong click alpha looked like a mild wind could blow him over now. Not because he was frail and weak, but because he wouldn't put up a fight against it. He would just let it push him over. Phil's brown eyes didn't sparkle, and Ryan had to turn away. It was like looking into the eyes of a corpse, and his heart couldn't take seeing it in such a young face. Track stepped into Ryan's line of view then. So, what are we going to do? He hissed. The anger in this one's eyes was easier to look back at. That was a feeling Ryan could grasp, but he didn't have the answers yet. Like them, he was still too filled with anger to think clearly. David stepped up next to his son. We need to find her, he stated, and Ryan nodded. Yes, they did. She had a right to know and a right to choose. The more instinctive reasons were there as well. A female packmate was being taken away from them against her will. Not forced physically, but manipulated. which was even worse. He looked around the room again and sighed. So that was it, then. The divide between the wolves and vampires had appeared again. It had been there not so many years ago. It was before his time, but not so long ago that the stories had been pulled into fables. The underlying feud was still visible, if you knew how to look. Plus, all of the subtle ways the two races avoided each other, like the fact that they rarely ever lived in the same place. Yes, they mingled outside, but after that, they all returned to their own packs, whether they called them that or not. Ryan noticed Phil stand then, and he turned. They all turned, watching him carefully. Two of them stepped up to block the path to the door. The room went quiet as Phil walked over slowly. Even that looked painful and was hard for them to watch. Track nodded to him, and Ryan knew he had to watch those two carefully. They were both too close to her and would jump at a chance without thinking it through. They couldn't make any stupid mistakes. Any more stupid ones, he thought in self-hatred. David put a hand on Phil's shoulder and gave him a supportive smile. Then Jackson walked over. "So, what's the plan?" Ryan drew in a long, slow breath. "We can't charge into this with anger. The vampires are powerful in ranks and numbers." One of the older wolves growled deeply. That was another point of deep resentment. Although it couldn't be proven outright, there were many who were certain that the vampires were to blame for their lack of females and even for their small numbers in general. It was more a story than anything, but a lot of wolves believed it. It was said that the vampires worried about the wolves outnumbering and overpowering them. They wanted to make sure they were always superior that way, and so, many centuries ago, they had secretly manufactured a serum that stunted the reproductive system in the werewolves. There were several opinions on how they distributed it, but the results were passed on through the generations. Not only did the effects make it hard for werewolves to conceive, it also made it extremely difficult to birth a female pup. Ryan knew the older wolves here believed it. A part of him believed it too. Their doctors had taken the eggs and sperm of wolves and genetically started female embryos. When they tried to create a male, they succeeded a handful of times. But when they tried to cross the genetics that would create a female, the DNA strands literally fell apart, to put it in regular people terms. There was no reason that even their best doctors could find. They had tested and retested. They had tried experiments that were probably unethical and still could not find a reason. Even more importantly, they could not find a cure. Whatever had been done to their ancestors was buried deeply in their DNA and silently wove its way through each pack and each generation. David and Ryan looked over at each other, and Ryan nodded. Sally and David had 5 children, something that was unheard of among werewolves. Most pairs were lucky to get 1 pup, and were considered amazing if they got 2. Thomas Beldren had 2 of his scientists work with the pack doctors when he fell in love with Raina's mother. They knew it was just a payment to keep the peace, but they were so eager to find a cure that they had accepted the help and were grateful. The vampire scientists created an injection that was given to the females that had mated and were trying to start a family. Most of those were able to conceive a pup. Some even had 2. Although they were all males. Sally had 4 boys. Eay only came along once Track and Raina became inseparable. Most of the older wolves were sure that Raina's father allowed this in hopes of keeping his daughter from becoming too close to the pack. It was only whispered about a few times, and only in council meetings, when a male wolf was angry that his own mate could not conceive. not angry with their mate or even themselves, just angry at the source. Ryan turned back to Jackson, seeing his own anger mirrored in the other's eyes. Track looked down at his phone and growled, "The coward won't even reply to my texts now." "No more threats," Ryan finally stated, and they all looked to him. He felt the burden as they all waited for him to continue. They would do whatever he told them to, and he worried, knowing that pursuing this would destroy the world they had already known. They had all known. The Poulsen pack had lived peacefully here for hundreds of years. Most of the younger ones had never known any other life. The vampire in that manner had made sure they never wanted for anything. They all had jobs, mostly within the werewolf or vampire community. Their town was always in perfect repair, and their children had grown up happy and able to enjoy all of that. Now, they were going to bite the hand that fed them, and bite it hard. Ryan knew what type of vampire Thomas Blvd was, but he also knew what type of father he was. He would guard his daughter and fight them with a rage that would be admired among the wolves, if they weren't on opposite sides now. "Thomas is a strong vampire," Ryan finally said. "His rank is unmatched." He watched them all carefully as he said it. Track was the first to react, with a laugh. "And he's filled Raina's head with so many lies by now that it'll take weeks to undo it all." Rock slammed one fist into his open other hand. "If he hurts one hair on her head—" David shook his head. "We all know how much that vampire covets his daughter. The harm he does to her will not be physical." He ended his statement in a low growl. The room fell silent again. Then Phil drew in a low, slow breath and stood up straighter than he had in days. "I can find her." All the wolves turned to him, and he nodded, pulling back his shoulders as a small spark of life ignited in his dim eyes. "I can sense her." "Sense her? From here?" Track asked, amazed. All mated wolves could sense each other to a point. It was more like getting an odd feeling if the other was hurt, or knowing they were just about to walk into a room before you could scent them. Plus, mates were usually always together. When they did need to be separated, they ached for each other, but being able to sense where they actually were, that only happened in stories. Phil nodded again, his eyes looking around at the others, the last few days still evident in his ragged form. "I have felt it every minute of every day since we bonded." He flinched a little, expecting another verbal onslaught. When no one responded, he drew in another breath. "She's in the city." How can you—" Jackson stuttered in awe, his eyes wide. "Where?" one of the older wolves snapped, as if ready to turn and head there that very minute. "I can't pinpoint her exactly. Not from this distance," Phil stated. Even his voice sounded a bit stronger. "But I can tell the general direction." Ryan had to hide his smile then. Part of him wanted to be furious at Phil for hiding something this important, but he knew why he had. Phil had planned to use this amazing pull when he finally found a way to escape. He bit the inside of his cheek. It's exactly what he would have done. Plus, now they had something even the vampires wouldn't expect. A tracking device that couldn't be shut off, unplugged, or destroyed. If Phil could sense her several hours away, the vampire's plan to hide Raina just became a lot less possible. It also answered a question that had been worrying Ryan and some of the others until this very moment. What if Phil was wrong about what happened in that cave that night? "What else can you sense?" Brian asked, the awe heavy in his voice. Ryan shot him a hard look, but then froze when Phil replied, "I can tell when she shifts." Eay-o-tay, one of the older wolves whispered, his voice shaky and low. All eyes were locked on Phil now, and the room went utterly still. Eay-o-tay was a word from the ancient werewolf language. The simple translation was true love, but it was a word that meant something much deeper than that. True bonding or pure bonding were terms that had replaced it in some stories. Ryan had never witnessed it, but, like the others in the room, he had been raised on the tales of it since he was a pup. It went far beyond the normal bonding of wolves. Wolves mated for life, and the love between them was real, strong, and amazing in its own right. But Eay-o-tay was a love so true, so pure, and so deep that it was as feared as much as revered. Ryan had never doubted that Phil had fallen in love with Raina that night, but this was something he hadn't expected. Unlike other races that spun wild stories out of the air, the wolves' stories were how they passed on their history and wisdom to the younger generations. They all knew their elders put their own spins on them, but they also knew that the bases of the tales were true, and every wolf cherished them. Rock shook his head. Eay-o-tay is just a legend, but there was no strength in his words. Ryan stared at Phil, and a small pang of envy hit him. Pure bonding went beyond anything that could be put into words. Then the envy changed to pity. If they truly experienced this unique bonding, Phil was right. He could never love any other. As beautiful and magical as it was also said to carry a curse as payment. Once bonded, the pair had to stay together. If they were separated, they would wither and die, literally. Ryan found himself hoping that what he had heard of Eay-o-tay had been spun out of proportion, and that only the profound love was real. Some stories had the pair able to cure sick water or even sick wolves. He smiled for a brief moment as he recalled his grandmother telling him about a pair that could even heal the dead. Finally, Track gave a hard nod. So we go to the city. We take Phil and see if he can locate her. When no one reacted, Track shook. Look, if this is somehow real, he glanced at Phil, who didn't react, then turned back to face the others. Phil's physical condition might actually be a reaction from being away from her. He looked around the room hard. We are going after her anyhow. She has the right to know the truth and choose. He swallowed hard, not able to finish the sentence. If it were somehow true, what was Raina going through? She wouldn't even understand what was happening to her. The pull, he whispered, more to himself, and grit his teeth. Another sign right there, and he hadn't seen it. She had told him about the strange pull she kept feeling. He lowered his head and growled at himself. Ryan put a hand up. Slow down, pup. We have to think this through. Think it through, Track snapped, the veins in his neck throbbing. He has taken her out of the manor and has hidden her somewhere so he can brainwash her against us. That was enough before we knew. And even if that part is just a story, the vampire isn't stupid, Ryan. He won't chance us finding her. He's going to move her further away, and soon. Phil's head shot up, and David shook his head. He'll have to come up with a story that she'll buy. Remember, as much as he is who he is, she is still Raina. She won't easily swallow just any story. Look what she did to try to see him before. Now they all felt the guilt. The signs were right there, and they had ignored them. Wolves did get depressed when their mates were gone, but looking at Phil, they had to have known it was they should have known it was something more. Then there was Raina's attempts to see him. even though she didn't know why. They should have. Rock nodded. She'll want to know what's happening. She'll want answers. And he will just twist his story and make her believe what he wants her to, Track hissed, still feeling the goosebumps down his arms. Eay-o-tay, he thought, and rubbed his hands over his arms again. Would she really believe him? One of the other wolves asked. Ryan pulled his eyes away from Phil. Look at it from her view, Brian. We kept her from Phil and wouldn't tell her why. When the others moaned, he nodded. We kept her out of Poulsen, away from her pack, and when she asked us why, what did we do? We lied, Rock moaned. We might as well have, Track growled. That is my fault, Ryan proclaimed, his shoulders sagging. I thought we were doing the right thing. She didn't remember that night. Then he shook his head. So I laid the groundwork for their perfect story. David shook his head. No, we all agreed with your decision. He shot his son a look and then continued. It was the best thing at the time. There was no way to know it was... They all glanced at Phil, and David sighed. There was no way to know. Have you tried to call her? Jackson asked Track. He nodded. Yeah, it says her number is no longer in use. They shut her phone off, completely. Phil growled then, and Track ran his hands through his hair. Great, so we thought we were doing the right thing to protect her, and now it is biting us directly in the... Track? His dad stated, and then turned back to Ryan. You are the alpha here, Ryan. We have complete faith in you. What do you suggest we do first? Ryan slowly looked from one face to the next, gauging their emotions and not being surprised by what he saw. He was glad to find that none of them showed any signs of blaming him for this. Seems he carried that burden alone. The guilt and self-loathing were a heavy yoke around his neck right now. Let's sit and talk this out. I want everyone's opinions and thoughts. We're not doing anything without careful thought this time. When Jackson's head tilted, Ryan gave a soft chuckle. Sometimes the wisest thing a wolf can do is to admit he has absolutely no idea what to do. Jackson nodded, then smiled. They all sat back down in the living room and started to talk. Chapter 10. I was a bit surprised that my dad stayed while we waited for Paige to bring my things. He and Jonathan even sat me down and taught me a card game. I had played a few when I was younger, but it had been years. Admittedly, I was surprised that my dad knew any at all. We were laughing, sitting on the floor in the living room, when Michaud stood and announced that Paige was here. I smiled up at him, and he turned away quickly. Okay, cheaters, I chuckled as I stood. It's a good thing we weren't play for money, or I would owe you both. A thought struck me then, but Jonathan was up and nudged me with my arm. He leaned into my ear. We can play for stakes later if you want. My dad's brows rose, and Jonathan cleared his throat and stepped quickly towards the elevator. He watched him, then turned to me. Raina, I think you and I have to have a talk. Okay, Dad, I smiled, having no clue what he wanted to talk to me about. I was too excited to see Paige, and more so to see Michael and Paige together. For some reason, it was important to me. I walked over and smiled up at Michael as we waited. He gave me his usual wink, and I gave one back. The elevator dinged and then opened. Paige looked at the lineup, and I noticed her hair was down, and I think she might have even put on a little makeup. I bounced on my toes. When she stepped out, my dad's men went in and got the suitcases and boxes off the elevator floor. She was wearing jeans, but she also had on a pretty white top and a short leather jacket over it. My dad finally chuckled. Are you all going to let her in? Michael stiffened and turned, allowing her to walk between us. I smiled and followed her, then grabbed her hand and drug her down the hallway to give her a tour. I showed her the entire apartment, and she smiled and commented on everything. When we got back to the main room, Jonathan was standing with my dad, and Michael was talking to the other guards. Michael turned, and I swear I saw him smile. My mind raced with options. Jonathan walked over and gave me a quick wink. I thought it might be a good idea if Paige stayed here with you. I wanted to hug him, but I only nodded. He looked at her. This isn't the manor. You'd have to share a room with Raina, he stated as my dad stepped up next to him. I wouldn't mind at all, Paige replied, trying to sound professional. I don't have another cot, but I'll order one and have it sent over immediately. She nodded. I would be happy to stay and help in any way I can. That time, I did catch her steal a look towards Michael. My dad actually laughed and then turned quickly when I shot him a hard look. You'll have to go back to the manor and get clothes and things, I stated, the plan forming quickly in my mind. I looked at Jonathan and his eyes widened. Yes, he stated. You could ride back with the others, but, he looked around the room, maybe Michael should go with you. That way he can drive you back. Okay, so that was extremely obvious. Paige was blushing deeply now, and my dad didn't help by laughing harder this time. Michael was staring at something on the floor, and I shrugged. Jonathan, you should order that bed now then. We'll need it by the time she gets back. I looked at the clock. It was 11 p.m. I almost told her it could wait until tomorrow, that she could sleep at the manor tonight. It would take over an hour there, just as long back, plus the time for her to pack. But I didn't. No matter who she rode with on the trip to the manor, it would give her and Michael time alone on the way back. My dad slapped his hands together. Well then, you better get going. He looked at Michael. I'm sure Martin can handle things until you get back. This once. He added the last part, and Michael stiffened. I smacked my dad's arm and pulled Paige towards the elevator. Take your time. I'm not sure how long I'll be here, so pack as much as you think you'll need. Then I turned to Michael. I'll be just fine. So no speeding back here. I think he wanted to groan. The situation was so completely obvious, but he only nodded and pulled Martin to the side for last-minute instructions. After they left, my dad shook his head. I think Aunt Mary would be proud of that. I chuckled. Seems even my dad called her Aunt Mary now. Well, dear, I guess I better get back too. Done kicking my butt in cards, I teased, and he shook his head. Just for now. He hugged me, and I squeezed him tightly. He gave Jonathan one of those guy looks, and then he left too, with his men. The room seemed so quiet now. It was just Jonathan, me, and Martin, who had quickly taken Michael's seat at the computers. I stood looking around the room. Without the distractions, the pain started to slip in again. I pictured Track's face and almost gasped as the pain hit. I looked down at my legs and Jonathan grabbed my arm. No, I whispered, it's okay. I walked down into my room, yanked my clothes off, pulled the gauze off my neck, and curled up on the rug. This time, I welcomed the pain. When I opened my eyes, I was panting hard. I stood and stretched, then shook myself. Jonathan called out from the hallway, and I gave a small bark. He opened the door and came in. I would have stayed with you while you shifted, he stated, kneeling in front of me. I wanted to save my clothes this time, I thought, and he chuckled. Oh, the bed, I barked, remembering that Paige would need something to sleep on. Already ordered and on its way, he smiled. I hope you didn't get her one of those fold-up ones like the guards have. It's a fold-up one, he stated, but a very nice fold-up one. I knew you wouldn't be happy otherwise." I snorted and he laughed. I felt that strange nagging again and turned to the east, lifting my muzzle and sniffing the air. Then my stomach growled and Jonathan stood. "Let's get that neck bandaged up and then get you something to eat." When I trotted out into the main room, Martin looked over and gave me a wink. I tilted my head. It just wasn't the same as when Michael did it. Jonathan left me to eat, and I consumed it quickly, then drank the water, splashing some over the floor. He cleaned it up and then looked down at me. "How about a trip to the garage?" I winced, thinking he was talking about that very embarrassing other thing I needed to do in this form. "It's good size and Martin can watch. It would give you a chance to stretch your legs a bit." "Oh!" I barked, and then barked again. He nodded and looked at Martin, who suddenly looked worried. He was used to being in Michael's shadow and not having to make decisions. "She'll be fine. You can come down with us and have other guards watch the front." Martin nodded slowly, and I wondered how long it would be before he was on the phone with Michael to make sure it was okay. I didn't have to wonder long. As soon as we headed for the door, he had his phone to his ear. When we switched elevators, Martin acted like agents in the movies. He held his hand out to keep us behind him, and his head turned to watch everything. We made it to the garage without incident, but Martin was talking into his phone again. I trotted around smelling everything. I sneezed when I sniffed a small puddle of shiny liquid, and I thought Martin was going to pass out. He knelt and inspected it, touching it and smelling his finger. "Oil," he stated, and then pushed some buttons on his phone again. I snorted a chuckle and trotted off to do more exploring. Jonathan was leaning against the wall by the elevator, and I looked over at him now and then. Part of me needed the reassurance that he was still there. Something kept pulling my attention, that bizarre tug inside of me. I trotted to the far wall, sniffing along the base of it like the answer might be there somewhere. Finally, I started to lope and even broke out into a slow run, stretching my muscles and keeping to the outside so I had more room. The garage was actually a decent size, and I was able to pick up a little speed. A few times I would change course, forcing myself to twist and turn quickly. One time I nipped at Jonathan as I ran past him. He laughed and then started to jog along next to me. That got my competitive juices going, and I ran a bit faster. He kept up, and I lowered my head and let my muscles take over. We rounded one corner, and I pushed off hard, determined to show him I was faster. Ha! I got ahead of him and flew down the side of the garage, barking in victory. When I turned to gloat, my paw hit another oil spot, and I lost my balance. I yelped as I fell forward, my chin scraping along the cement floor. My body instinctively rolled to counter the fall, and I yelped louder as I hit the wall. When I stood up, I shook myself hard, then felt the stinging under my chin. Jonathan had ran over and knelt next to me. Great. This is why they say gloating is bad. I snorted. "I'm fine. Just a bruised ego," I chuckled. He grinned and then lifted my chin. "It's not that bad. Just need to clean it up and you should be fine." We both turned, and I moaned as we saw Martin, again on his phone, gesturing wildly. "If he makes Michael rush back here, I'll bite him," I growled. Jonathan laughed and stood. "I'll take care of it. You go play." "Go play?" I huffed, and he grinned as he left. "Go play?" I snorted, and then did just that. My chin stopped hurting almost immediately, and I started to bark and attack my shadow. It was actually rather amusing, but it lost its appeal after a few minutes. I saw the tail out of the corner of my eye and thought about chasing it, but luckily my dignity stopped me before I did. Finally, I trotted back towards Jonathan, this time explaining that I needed a quick alone minute. He took me to a back door and opened it. Martin nearly lost his mind when Jonathan refused to let him follow. Gads, was nothing private to bodyguards? When I came back in, I growled at the big man and then ran the perimeter of the garage a few more times. On my fourth lap, I slowed and even yawned. I wasn't tired from running. A werewolf could run for hours, but my internal clock said this wolf should be asleep. I shook myself, then loped a few more times, then finally trotted one more. As I passed Jonathan, he gave me that look, and I wondered if my dad had taught him how to do that. So, just to spite him, I trotted around again. What that proved, I'm not sure, other than I would stop when I wanted to. When we got back up to the apartment, Martin seemed to relax a little. I yawned again, and Jonathan looked down at me. You need to go to bed. I thought about arguing with him. Again, not sure why. But instead, I snorted and started down the hallway, with him following me. Just as I stepped into the room, two thoughts hit me at the same time. Both had the same conclusion. Jonathan wasn't going to be able to lay with me tonight. For one, I was a wolf, and two, Paige was coming. Great. We could have at least snuggled and talked for a while until she got here. I glanced up at the clock and then growled. Why couldn't I read it? That was almost as frustrating as the no thumbs thing. I'm going to shift back, I thought, looking up at Jonathan. He smiled down at me and went to my closet while I walked into the bathroom. I curled up on the rug there, and this time did cry out a bit as the pain hit. For some reason, I couldn't step out of it like I normally could. I screamed part way through and again wished that death would finally find pity on me and take me. Finally, it was over. I was curled up and shaking hard. Jonathan was calling to me and I didn't respond. Every part of me hurt and I couldn't move my mouth to answer him. I heard the door open and something was laid over me. It was warm and felt good. He scooped me up in his arms and carried me into the room, laying me gently on the bed. I moaned, but even that hurt. Why was it so painful this time? I felt the tears try to come, but they seemed to know that that would hurt too, and mercifully stayed away. I barely noticed him putting the salve on and wrapped my neck. Everything else hurt so much worse. You need to put some clothes on, Jonathan whispered after a few minutes. I nodded slowly and he handed me a t-shirt. I clenched my teeth as I pulled it over my head, but I did gasp and cry out as I slipped the pajama bottoms on. Once I was dressed, he pulled the blankets over me and I sighed into the pillow. He laid on the bed next to me but was careful not to touch me. For a few minutes I thought he might have fallen asleep. Since full vampires don't breathe, I couldn't tell. Are you awake? I finally whispered when my body calmed. Yes. I rolled over slowly, wincing. He was watching me, but wasn't smiling. I'm sorry, I whispered, and his brows knitted over his gray eyes. Why are you sorry? For upsetting you. I hate seeing that look in your face. We were almost nose to nose, and he shook his head. Don't ever say that. I just hate seeing you in pain. I reached over and stroked his cheek. It passes quickly, I smiled, but he didn't. Then I leaned closer and kissed him softly. He put one arm around me and held me very gently as we kissed. When I finally pulled back, he was smiling, and I chuckled. If there was a way to stop this shifting, he stated carefully, would you? I balked and went to snap at him, ready to accuse him of not really accepting my wolf's side, but I stopped. That wasn't what I was seeing in his eyes. He knew how excruciating they were for me, and like he said, He hated to see me in so much pain. I couldn't imagine what it was like to watch from the outside. If you asked me during a shift, I would say yes in a minute, I tried playfully. He sighed softly. I just hate what you have to go through. I know, and I'm sorry that you had ever had to see it. He was stroking my cheek now, and I got lost in his beautiful eyes. When he went to pull me closer, I was able to keep my yelp inside, and I snuggled up next to him, with the blanket still properly between us. I chuckled. What's so funny? For some reason, the image of Aunt Mary just popped into my head. He laughed then, too, kissing the top of my head. I swear she has special powers, he snickered, and I nodded, forcing myself not to look over my shoulder to see if she was there. We laid there quietly, enjoying the calmness and just being together. I wondered about Paige and Michael and smiled, thinking of them driving, hopefully alone. I hope he lets her sit up in front with him, I said. Michael. Oh, Jonathan laughed and moved back a bit, looking down at me. Here we are, laying in each other's arms, and that's what you're thinking about, he teased. I shrugged. Well, not the whole time. What were you thinking about? He grinned at me. I was thinking about the mini manor. You were? I almost shouted, and then propped up on one pillow. It almost didn't hurt now. He mimicked the gesture and smiled. I think we should go look at it. I shook my head in amazement. But it's too far away. Not really. I won't be spending much time at the office anyhow. He winked and I grinned. It was selfish of me, I know, but I was in love with it just from the pictures. Are you sure? You will have to go to work sometime, I teased. He laughed and shook his head. I think we should look at it tomorrow. My eyes widened. Really? Tomorrow? Don't you have to make an appointment? Raina, I may not be Thomas Beldrin, but the name Jonathan Hilvar does have some pull around here. Wow, really? I gasped playfully. He sat up more and I laid back down, so he was leaning over me. I know you think me a simple man, my love, but your future husband is actually quite powerful in his own right. I batted my eyes up at him. I must admit that's a bit disappointing. I rather like simple men. Oh, really? He growled teasingly above me. Yes, I whispered sheepishly. They're so much easier to bewitch. He clucked his tongue. A man's worth or rank means nothing when a woman is involved. How so? I pretended to gasp. The love of a woman reduces all men to the same level of weakness. Rank, wealth, breeding, none of it matters at that point. A single look from the right woman can drop the highest vampire as quickly as the lowest. I giggled and he leaned down and barely kissed my lips. And each and every one of us welcomes the chance to be a victim. I wrapped my arms around his neck and kissed him hard. When Paige and Michael finally arrived, we both got up and went out to greet them. I saw the folded bed in the living room, and once again was glad I couldn't blush. Michael and Jonathan quickly took it and Paige's bags into my room. This really is a nice place, she smiled at me. We're going to go look at another place tomorrow, I announced, and then grabbed her hand and took her to Jonathan's study. He had printed out pictures of the manor when we had first looked at them, and I found them on top of his desk. She was also amazed at the similarities. You'll have to come with us when we look at it, I smiled, then frowned. I don't mean you have to, I just meant... She shook her head. I knew what you meant, and if you want me to come, I'd love to. I wiggled my brows. Well, Michael will have to come. She blushed again, and as much as I wanted to ask her about the ride there, I didn't. I knew what it was like to have everyone prying into your personal life. If she wanted to tell me, she would. I started to look through the papers, trying to find one that showed what they were asking for it. I hadn't been able to see that information online, and I was curious. Jonathan stepped into the room, saw the printouts in our hands, and smiled. Everything is set up. We didn't unpack your bags, though. He winked at me. I know what lines not to cross. Paige smiled. Thank you, Jonathan. You really didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, he laughed, and then took one of the pictures out of my hand and glanced at it. Can Paige come with us tomorrow when we look at it? I had hoped she'd want to, he smiled. He was so incredibly wonderful. I inhaled slowly, looking at him, and he winked at me. When I continued to smile at him, he peered at me playfully. What's that look for? Just because you're amazing, I stated, then balked and remembered that Paige was standing there. He beamed, though, and Paige quickly excused herself. As soon as she left, he pulled me into his arms. I think that's the first time you've ever said anything like that with somebody else around. Really? Wow, that didn't make me look so great. Was I really that bad? Don't you dare overanalyze that, he smiled. And I wondered if I had thought that with the not-so-private part of my mind. Your eyes, Raina, they tell me a lot more than you think. Oh, I chuckled, and he kissed me. I tossed the pictures onto his desk and smiled. Maybe I could sleep in your room tonight. He grinned down at me. If you want to. I bit my lower lip, suddenly feeling like a child that might get caught. When I didn't answer, he chuckled. How about we go lay in there and watch a movie together? My brows lifted and he shrugged. When you fall asleep, I'll carry you back to your own bed, and no one can say that we slept in the same bed. Well, last night was all I got out, and he put a finger softly over my lips. Careful. Aunt Mary might hear you. I giggled and nodded. Then he took my hand, and we headed down the hall. I felt the need to poke my head in and show Paige the bathroom, and make sure she had enough places to put her things. Then I explained that Jonathan and I were just going to watch a movie, and I would be in as soon as it was over. She smiled at me. Raina, I'm here as your friend and your PT, that's all. I'm not here to hover over you. That's my job. We all turned as Michael stepped into the room. I rolled my eyes, and he gave Jonathan a quick look. I huffed, took Jonathan's hand, and pulled him into the hallway. I didn't make it halfway through the movie. I don't even remember Jonathan carrying me into my own bed. But when I woke up the next morning, I was in a foul mood. Normally, I wake up slowly, letting the smells and sounds around me drift in. This time, my eyes shot open, and I sat up fast. Paige's bed was neatly made, and I glared at it. Then I felt a sudden urge to throw myself into the pillow and cry. The confusing emotions added to my frustration, and I flung the covers off me. When I heard a thump, I turned and saw Wolfie laying on the floor. I rushed over and picked him up, brushing non-existent dirt off him and glaring at the wall. I laid my ragged little friend gently on the bed, pulled the covers up on him, and then stormed to the closet. The hanger almost broke as I yanked a shirt off of it. Then I snatched my pants and underwear out of the drawer and stomped into the bathroom. Even the long, hot shower didn't help my mood. Once my hair was dried, I glared at my reflection. What in the world is wrong with you today? I snapped at it, and then went to toss my pajamas into the hamper. It wasn't there. I felt my jaw twitch and shook my head, then found the clothes basket, tossed them in, and walked back into the room. Jonathan was sitting in the chair that was now pushed into the corner at the end of my bed. He stood and smiled, and I had to force myself to smile back. He glanced over at Wolfie. I'm a bit jealous, he teased. I rolled my eyes. It's a stuffed animal, Jonathan, I snapped and walked out of the room. He grabbed my arm in the hallway and turned me. What's wrong? I don't know, I whispered. I woke up this morning wanting to shred anything and everything. When he didn't reply fast enough, I yanked my arm back. Don't worry. I don't expect you to fix this too. Then I stormed down the hall, all the while wondering what was wrong with me. Part of me wanted to turn and apologize, but I huffed and kept going. Paige was sitting up on a tall chair at the island with a plate in front of her. She smiled at me, and I gave a hard nod, then looked around the room. Great. There was nowhere to go. Michael was standing at the end of the counter. Seems I had interrupted their conversation. Martin was sitting at the computer desk. At least one of them is doing their job, I thought, and then my eyes widened. I turned and nearly ran into Jonathan as I rushed back down the hallway and into my room. I shut the door harder than I meant to and shook my head. What is your problem? I actually hissed. I paced the room trying to figure out what was wrong. This was not me. I didn't act like this. Jonathan knocked on the door and I whirled around. Leave me alone, I snapped, and then gasped. Did that really come out of my mouth? I rushed to the door and opened it. He was still standing there, and his eyes were as wide as mine. I am so sorry, I whispered as he walked in. I don't know what's wrong with me. He kept his distance, but nodded. You've been through a lot, Raina. Don't you dare start with that speech again, I shot, and then ran into the bathroom and shut the door. Get a grip, I growled at myself. Whatever this is, you have to stop it. I paced roughly in the small space, glancing up and glaring at myself in the mirror as I passed it. What was wrong with me now? Did it have something to do with the painful shift? I stopped in the middle of the floor and looked down at my body, hating it for putting me through all this. As I did, my necklace fell out. The wolf and pack mark dangling from each side of the security box. Track's face flashed in my mind, and the pain slammed into my chest. I gasped and slid down onto the floor, then lifted the chain and stared at the two charms. I wrapped my fists around them and leaned my head forward, resting on my hand. Please, please, I just want it back the way it is. I sobbed quietly. The way it was, I sobbed quietly. That strange nagging feeling came again, and I lifted my head, half expecting someone to be standing there. Who? I thought. The tears still fell as I tried to figure out the source of the pull that didn't seem to want to go away. My heart hurt, my mind hurt, and this odd sensation wouldn't let me understand what it was. I drew in a slow breath and closed my eyes, trying to concentrate only on it. As I did, I gave a small gasp. The air seemed to change, not visibly, but noticeably. I lifted my chin, with my eyes still closed, and sniffed, trying to determine what the smell was. It seemed earthy in a way, like leaves and grass, dirt and rocks. I leaned forward, putting my free hand on the floor. There was water here, too. Not close, but I could smell the crisp wetness of it. My head turned, again feeling as if somebody would be, or should be, standing there. I opened one eye slowly, seeing only the bathroom floor. I closed it quickly and tried to focus. Whatever this feeling was, I wanted it to stop. I needed to find the reason behind it before it drove me mad. Then I heard talking in the other room, and I growled. The feeling slipped away, and I sat back hard, my back thumping into the cabinet. The necklace clunked around my chest when I dropped it, but I barely noticed. I waited for several minutes, testing the air with my sensitive nose. Finally I stood, washed my face, ran a brush through my hair, and walked out. Jonathan and Paige turned, both smiling at me. There was a small twinge of annoyance, but luckily my extremely foul mood seemed to have calmed. Jonathan was trying to say that you and I should take his room, she explained. It's much bigger, he nodded, and I shook my head. We're fine here. He went to argue, but Paige interrupted. So, when are we going to go see this manor? She gave him a look that I didn't catch, and he shrugged. Whenever Raina's ready. Didn't you have to set a time with the agent? I asked. He smiled, and I rolled my eyes. Yeah, vampires with pull. I got it. Okay, so my mood wasn't completely back to normal. We can go now. Jonathan nodded and pulled out his phone. He left the room, and Paige grinned at me. I smiled then, and it felt good. I'm here whenever you need to talk, she whispered, stepping up to me. Thank you, I replied, and then sighed. It just hurts so much, Paige. My voice actually shook, and her smile dropped. She reached out and took my hand. I can't even imagine what this is doing to you. I felt the tingle in my nose, and then Michael walked into the room. I cleared my throat and looked down at the floor. We'll be ready to leave in 10 minutes, he stated, and left quickly, realizing he had interrupted something. It was just enough for me to regain my composure, though. I looked down at myself. Do you think what I'm wearing is okay? Why wouldn't it be? We both turned as Jonathan walked in, and I shook my head. Well, I just thought... He chuckled. You look fine. Better than fine, actually. He winked, and I smiled at him. He was wearing jeans as well, but somehow they looked much more refined on him. Suddenly, Paige gasped, and I jumped. Jonathan gave her a hard look, and she blushed. I'm sorry. I just remembered something. She looked at me, and when I only frowned, she shrugged. I brought something that I was keeping for you? My head tilted a little, and she nodded. In my dresser drawer? I shook my head, and then my eyes widened. The gift, I explained, and she smiled. I turned to Jonathan. I never gave you your gift. After the party. How could I have forgotten about that? Okay, so there's plenty of reasons, but still. He smiled at me. I was wondering when that would come up. I looked at him hard, and he shrugged. I wanted to wait until you were ready. Oh, I'm sorry, Paige stated. I grabbed it when I was packing. No, thank you, I smiled at her, reaching out and squeezing her hand. I'm glad you did, and I'm glad you brought it up. Jonathan shrugged, grinning. Well then, I guess I need to get yours. Panic flooded through me then. What if he didn't like the keychain? It was such a stupid idea. Why hadn't I thought of something better? I'll be right back, he stated, and then left. Paige went to the closet and unzipped a soft-sided suitcase. She rummaged through it and then turned and handed me the small box. I can't give him this, I whispered, as she placed it in my hand. I don't know what I was thinking. He'll love it, she grinned, and I shook my head. Raina, trust me, he will. When she stopped short, I turned and then yelped and shoved my hand behind my back as Jonathan smiled at us. Paige quickly excused herself and shut the door as she left. I noticed he had one hand behind his back as well. At least, it wasn't too big. He motioned to the bed, and I walked over and sat on the edge. He followed me and then chuckled. So who goes first, or do we do it at the same time? Same time? I whispered, and he nodded. He counted to 3, and we both pulled our hands out. His box was almost the same size as mine, although his was a deep blue and looked like velvet. It wasn't supposed to cost a lot, I gasped. I know. I stuck to the rules. Oh. My heart was racing, and finally he held out the box to me. I took it, almost shoving his at him. "We have to open them at the same time," he chuckled. I nodded and moved a shaking hand to the top of the beautiful box. I pulled the top off and looked inside, tilting my head. Laying on a bed of blue tissue paper was a small wooden heart, about the size of a 50-cent piece, with initials burnt into it, JH plus RB. My eyes watered as I reached in and ran a finger over the carvings. "I made it myself," came his soft voice, and I could only nod. "It's treated, though, so it's weatherproof." Who cared, I thought. This was the most amazing gift. I didn't notice the tears until he reached out and wiped them away. "I hope that means you like it." I smiled and nodded, still not able to speak. Then he reached into the box and lifted it. A small golden chain was attached to the bottom of the heart, with 2 golden keys dangling off it. One I recognized immediately. It was the same odd-shaped key he had used in the elevator to get to his apartment. The other key was even stranger. The top was round like an ordinary key, but the long shaft was straight, with no grooves or markings at all. He held up the one, and I looked up at him as he did. "This one will be made when we get our own place," he smiled. I felt as if the air in my lungs had been squeezed out. I couldn't talk, and he smiled. Then he opened my hand and sat the keychain in the palm. "Don't look at the heart too closely," he chuckled. "I've never actually carved anything before. It's a bit lopsided." I went to open my mouth, but nothing came out. He winked at me, and I watched as he lifted the top on the box I had given him. Suddenly, my store-bought metallic keychain looked like a monster, and I wanted to snatch it away from him. Somehow, though, he knew how it worked and slid one side open, looking at the picture of the 2 of us. The room got very quiet, and I couldn't see his reaction as he bent over it. "The other side opens too," I whispered in a shaky voice. He turned it over and slid that side out. I had changed my mind on the note, and had actually had one of my dad's maintenance men show me how to use the engraver. I had practiced it on spare pieces until I finally wrote the message inside the compartment. "Forever yours, Raina," he whispered, and his voice was shaking now too. I blinked hard as the salty tears blurred my vision. Then he looked up and smiled at me. His eyes were so soft, and they seemed almost moist. "It's the greatest treasure I have ever been given," he smiled. Under any other circumstances, that would sound corny, but right now, all I could do was smile back. "Well, almost the greatest," he replied, and then leaned forward and kissed me. And that's where I'm going to stop.